Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name is Ford, and this week I'm going to be talking to you about places that you can start your cross stitch project other than the middle of the fabric. If you've ever learned anything from any of my videos, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave me a comment when we're done. It doesn't cost you anything to do that, and it makes a really big difference for me, so I'd really appreciate it if you did. Now, the received wisdom as far as where to start your cross-stitch project has always been that you should start your project in the middle. That way you work your way out and you make sure that your project is centered on the piece of fabric when you're done. There are a few other reasons as far as workflow and as far as thread tension that is the case, but it's not the only way to do it. A lot of people like to use gridding or like to use scroll frames, and with either of those methods, working from the middle is just not quite as practical. So a lot of people these days will start their projects most frequently from a corner. And one thing that I've noticed is which corner you start from depends mostly on whether you're right-handed or left-handed and the order in which you complete your stitches. People who go from the bottom left corner to the top right corner and are right-handed feel most comfortable starting in the top left of their project. And if they're left-handed, they start in the top right. I'm not sure why, it's just what feels natural to people. But starting in a corner can allow you to take advantage of things like gridding, and it makes it easier to work with things like a scroll frame. But it does potentially create some problems, so I'm going to talk you through how to figure out where to actually put your first stitch on your project if you're starting from somewhere other than the center. Take just a second right now and go sign up for our Stitch Club email newsletter. As soon as you sign up, you'll get an ebook with 10 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in it worth £60, plus you'll be kept up to date on all the upcoming news about upcoming stitch-alongs, retreats, socials, that kind of stuff. The 2026 cross-stitch retreat went on sale and almost immediately sold out. So if you want to get advance notice about any of those so that you can make sure you get a ticket, hit the link down there in the description or in the pinned comment. Now, if we're starting from somewhere besides the center, we need to figure out how big our project is going to be relative to the piece of fabric that we're using. We don't always have all of the pieces of information that we need in order to figure that out. So in order to calculate that, the first thing we need to know is how big our project is going to end up. And that relies on two pieces of data: how big the project is in stitches and how many stitches per inch we're going to be doing on our fabric. That's known as the count of the fabric. So let's figure both of those out for an example project. So say I'm going to be working from this kit, and I trust that the piece of fabric that I've been given is big enough, but I don't know exactly how much bigger than my project it is, and when I finish it, I want my project to be centered, just because it'll make it easier to frame and display. So the first thing I need to know is how big my project is in stitches. That is 195 by 87 stitches for this particular project. So I know how many stitches, and say perhaps you're working from a kit and you don't know the exact count of the fabric, or you kitted the project up at some point in the distant past and you don't remember for sure what you've got. So it's useful to be able to figure out what the count of a fabric is. Now, with a lot of experience, sometimes you can tell just by looking at it, but there can be some variation and things that make a little bit different, so it's pretty easy to figure out. All we need to do is to look at the count of our fabric and to count out how many stitches there are in 1 inch. So all we do is we compare the number of holes in the fabric to the measurement of 1 inch on a ruler. But there's a pretty useful little cheat code we can use with Ada, which is that 1 inch rulers are generally subdivided into 1/16 of an inch markings. So if we look at the holes on our fabric and we look at the markings on our ruler and we see that all the way across those little markings line up with the holes in the fabric, we know that that is 16 count fabric, because 16 count fabric means it has 16 stitches per inch that we're going to be doing on it. So when we look at it like this and we see, all those holes line up perfectly with the little markings on our 1 inch ruler, then we know that it's 16 count fabric. If it doesn't quite perfectly line up, or if we're not totally sure, then all we need to do is to count how many spaces between holes there are on the fabric. This is a pretty important thing to remember because we're not counting the holes in the fabric, we're counting the spaces between the holes. We don't want to commit a fence post error here in our counting. So we can just count across for 1 inch, and that will give us our fabric count. This is going to be 16 count fabric. So I know that my fabric count here is 16. So to get my finished project size, all I need to do is divide the stitch count by the fabric count, and that will give me the size in inches. So I'm going to divide the 195 stitch width by my 16 fabric count, and I'm going to wind up with 12 3/16 inches wide for my project by 5 7/16 inches high. So now I know how big my project is going to end up. I need to compare that to the size of the fabric that I have. And that one's easy, we just measure it. So my fabric is 17 inches wide by 10 6/16 or 3/8 inches high. One of the best parts about cross stitch is the community aspect of it, that you can do it with a group. You're kind of missing out on that if you're not in any social cross-stitching spaces. A great place to start would be the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group or the following of the Instagram. Make sure you check both of those out. It's a very worthwhile space to be in. So now that I know the size of my finished project and the size of my fabric, I can calculate how big the difference between those two is, and I'll know how much margin I'm going to have around all 4 sides. So all I need to do is to subtract my project size from my fabric size for both width and height, and that will tell me that amount. So that's going to wind up being 4 13/16 inches on the width and 4 15/16 inches on the height. Now, because of the fact that I want my project to be centered in my fabric, I want to have half of that difference on each dimension, because I need to have the same amount of distance here and here and here and here so that my project is centered. So I want to figure out what half of that difference is, and that's how far away from the corner of my fabric I'm going to put my first stitch. Now it's at this point that we're dealing with a difference of less than the width of 1 stitch, so I can go ahead and round those figures off. I'm going to wind up with 2 7/16 inches on the width and 2 1/2 on the height extra on each side. So that's how far from the corner I want to make my first stitch. I want to come in from the side by 2 7/16. I want to come down from the top or bottom by 2 1/2. So then all I need to do is make the measurements and mark where I'm going to put my first stitch. So I'm going to measure in 2 7/16 from the side. And then I'll just measure straight along the row of stitches to 2 1/2. Then you can mark that with whatever you want that is safe to mark your fabric with. And I'm going to caution you again here against using Pilot friction pens on fabric. They don't actually disappear, they just go milky white, and you can still see them. Plus, over time, their thermochromic pigments break down, the things that change color when they get heated, and return to kind of a middle of the tone range. So the ink will someday reappear on your project if you use those friction pens. I see people recommending them all the time, and it's a terrible idea. So using my dressmaker's pencil, I've marked right here where the top left corner of my project is going to be if it is perfectly centered on the fabric. So what I would do from there is I would just load up my thread and get started and make my first stitch right there. Here to try something new? Check out Caterpillar Crochet. It's the same beginner-friendly kits and patterns that you've come to know and love, as well as the amazing supportive community. Find us on Facebook or on Instagram to get started. Now, where to start your project on the fabric is one of those things that all of us have been told that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it, and that if you don't do it in a particular way, you're doing it wrong. I don't really believe in doing it wrong. This is our art. This is our creative expression. We do it in the ways that make sense to us and the ways that we enjoy. There are sometimes very good reasons why it has always been done a particular way, but sometimes the reasons don't really apply anymore. Sometimes the reasons are things like, when cross-stitch became a popular art form, most people didn't have a reliable measuring tool in their home that could measure down to that degree of accuracy. Or the fabric that people were using didn't have that even of a weave, so you couldn't necessarily count on your measurements that much. But those things don't really apply anymore. So if there's a way that works better for you and makes it more approachable and more accessible and make more sense to you, then by all means do that. I don't believe in wrong, and I don't even believe in should. I just believe in what works well for you and doing things with a good reason. So if starting in the corner makes you happy, go for it. And if anybody tries to tell you you're doing it wrong, you send them to me. Anyway, that is all I have for you this week. I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.